A key principle of monetarist economics is that monetary policy works best when it's conducted according to simple, pre-announced rules. That adage is an old one, but it would seem to ring true, as true today as ever before, at a time when the Federal Reserve faces a myriad of economic and political risks. In this second panel, we have 3 papers that speak directly to the issue by Athanasios Orphanides, by Andrew Levin, and by Mickey Levy and Michael Bordo. And this session will be followed by a third, during which Charlie Plosser will summarize, synthesize, and offer up some comments of his own. So I'm really eager to get to all 4 speakers, and that's why we're getting back to work right away. Let's get started first with Athanasios.
Thanks, Peter. So pleasure to be here on this panel, especially following up the wonderful panel that discussed the issues of independence of the Federal Reserve, more specifically, and central banks more generally. And in my intervention, I will actually touch on that issue by starting in the handout. You're going to see it on page 2, with a quote in the Wall Street Journal article on August 6, 2019 by Volcker, Greenspan, Bernanke, and Yellen. And I want to start with, because I want to segue from the discussion we had on independence to the discussion on the monetary policy frameworks and rules and how the two interact. So let me remind you some events and tweets were happening and are still happening, which is the reason many of us are concerned about the Federal Reserve's independence. And the 4 past chairs in August noted in an editorial that even the perception that monetary policy decisions are politically motivated can actually do a lot of damage. And I fully agree with that. I'm not sure if anybody in this room would disagree with this particular statement, even perceptions, which makes it quite important to take a back seat and ask ourselves what could create such perceptions. And how could the Federal Reserve inadvertently, perhaps, lead to perceptions, maybe based on fact, maybe completely unfounded, but if you're an observer like me in Cambridge, Massachusetts, sometimes you cannot tell which is which. And one of the significant elements for understanding whether decisions are politically motivated or are not politically motivated would be whether we can justify them by understanding how the independent body acts. And this is where I'm gonna actually follow up on Charlie's point earlier on. Process is quite important for helping us understand whether an independent agency like the Federal Reserve is indeed doing its job in a technocratic manner, or potentially is influenced by factors we wouldn't want as a public to be influenced by. So the bottom channel of the bottom part of page 2 in the handout, I give you an example of that. This is the latest FOMC projections. I just print the medians, and we know that between the June and September meeting, we had a 50 basis points drop in the policy rate. Now, I'm a traditionally trained macroeconomist, I guess a little bit between Charlie and Debbie, not quite, it's like a convex combination of the two. I look at this thing and I say, well, okay, so the way I was taught monetary policy, it has to be forward-looking, so you check, has the outlook evolved in a way that would require either a hike or a cut in interest rates so that the Fed balances the risks going forward. And what I found striking in the latest SEP is that, if you look at real GDP growth, the unemployment rate, core PCE, virtually nothing changed. And the only thing that changed, really, is, 50 basis points cut in interest rates. So how exactly are we to understand this? And this is part of the problem associated with a frequent theme in our meetings of the shadow committee, the fact that too many decisions, if not all decisions, that the FOMC is taking have an unnecessary discretionary element. And this use of discretion, you can always find some rationale to justify anything you want if you are following a discretionary policy. And many of us here worked at the Fed, so we know how it's done. It was part of our job to do it sometimes. And the question is, how do we protect an institution against this unhelpful discretion? This is, again, a theme we've revisited many times. One of the ways the institution can improve its policies and defend itself from unnecessary discretion and defend itself from the perception that perhaps other factors are driving policy decisions, perhaps it's politically motivated or not, which I don't think that's not my baseline assumption, but perceptions here. So one way to get around that is by trying to describe a policy in terms of monetary policy rules. And what I want to show you is that, as a matter of fact, we can describe quite a bit of what the Fed has been doing in terms of simple policy rules. If you go on page 3 of my panel, I plot 4 forecast-based versions of policy rules that are very similar to policy rules that the Federal Reserve started publishing in its monetary policy report in the last few years. The only difference here is that I actually focus on forecast-based. So this is like looking at 3-quarter ahead forecast, because the short-term forecasts of the economy capture the current state of the economy and better explain what we can expect policy to do. So the bottom panel of page 3 in figure 1 shows you the implementation of the 4 policy rules I have in the top panel. One is a classic Taylor rule, but forecast-based. The other is Janet Yellen's favorite, so-called balanced approach rule, and 2 implementations of what the Fed is calling a first difference rule. One implementation based on growth, the implementation based on the employment rate. And we can actually plot all of this just based on the SEP. And since 2012, when the FOMC participants have started providing information, even about concepts like R star implicitly by telling us what the neutral policy rate is, we can literally take the SEP and construct versions of forecast-based rules like this and try to understand policy. You're going to see here that the first difference rule do a better job of describing policy in the tightening phase. My favorite one is the forecast-based first difference rule with growth. Let me tell you a minute what this is doing. So this is saying, just check whether GDP growth over the next 3 quarters, year on year ending in 3 quarters, meaning starting in T-1, going to T+3, check if that is higher or lower than your estimate of potential GDP growth. Again, we can take the SEP's long-term normal growth as one concept of that. Then take inflation, compare that to your target, and judge. Is effectively the sum of inflation and real output growth. Well, what is the sum of inflation and real output growth? That's like nominal income, if you wish. It's a proxy for nominal income growth. So is nominal income growth projected to increase too fast or too slow compared to normal? And what's normal? Potential real growth plus 2% inflation. It's not that complicated to look at this. So that rule actually does a pretty good job in picking up, for example, the tightening phase of the cycle. But you're going to see that it cannot tell us anything about where the 50 basis points cut in the last quarter came from. Again, we're left with, looking from the outside, I'm trying very hard to understand what the Fed is doing in a systematic fashion. I think a benchmark rule would be the first step for the Federal Reserve to explaining what it's doing. And of course, I understand that, and Debbie I think was alluding to that no simple rule can explain everything. So if there are other elements that worry us, and we hear a lot about risk management and risks here and risk there and so forth, Well, maybe we need communication about that if we're going to trust what this independent agency is doing. And frankly, there isn't any communication about that in the SEP. And you will remember we've discussed this before at the previous meeting we had. Mickey presented a proposal on how the committee could be communicating uncertainty better. And uncertainty isn't quite the sort of risk scenario that the FOMC has been telling us about. But again, just telling us, trust us, we see some risks, and this is why we cut 50 basis points, even though the baseline scenario doesn't really justify that, is somewhat problematic. Let me end by suggesting another thing. So what I've shown you here in Figure 1 is based on the FOMC's projections. So this is the median projections of FOMC participants. And I know the imperfections in that. Not all participants vote. Yeah, we'll have Charlie Plosser can explain all of these details. I'll go into that later on if you want to, Charlie. Still, that's what the committee is giving us. This is what they voted to present to us, so the median is the best summary I have. But we don't really need to rely exclusively on the FOMC for this. We can actually do similar exercises with private forecasts that we can whose credibility we can examine. So in the last page, I actually have the rule I just described a few minutes ago, the natural growth rule. This actually is the rule that the Fed has been tracking for, I don't know, 15 years or so. Andy will remind me if I have the date right in Blue books and then Teal books. But this is using the survey of professional forecasts, median forecast of nominal GDP. And I thought it would be useful to show this to you today, since we have a guest speaker from the Philly Fed, and it's really a wonderful job that they're doing at the Philadelphia Fed in providing us with this nice survey that we can use. So what does this say? Look at the bottom panel of page 4. These are the inputs to the rule. It's really very simple as a starting point. The dashed line is the natural growth rate. What is that thing? This is the forecaster's estimate of what potential real GDP growth is, plus 2%, because 2% is our nominal target. This is what the natural growth rate would be of nominal income. And then the solid line is the nominal GDP growth forecast, again, year ahead. So all you need to do here is simply compare. Is growth projected to be above or below natural growth? Measure the gap, and then see whether you raise or cut interest rates. In this particular implementation, this is just multiplied the difference by 0.5 to get a policy prescription for the policy rule. You're going to see in the very last quarter here, natural growth rate and nominal GDP growth forecasts are on top of each other. So on the basis of baseline scenario, no 50 basis points, actually no move at all, not even 25 basis points would have been justified at all. So I leave you where I started. I'm worried about the Fed's independence, but I believe that the Fed must share some of the blame for the predicament it faces right now and the concerns that so many of us have about the Fed's independence. What is the problem? The Fed relies too much on discretion, doesn't explain well enough why it's doing what it's doing, which allows a lot of room for perceptions that, I'm going to go back to the editorial from Wall Street Journal, perceptions that monetary policy and decisions are politically motivated. This is perceptions, as the 4 previous chairs have told us. And I think the Fed can do a much better job of getting rid of such perceptions if it becomes more systematic with the adoption of a benchmark rule. Thanks.
Let's follow suit from the previous session and just take one question for Athanasios. Doug.
Hi, I'm Doug Carr with Hart Street Institute. And Athanasios, I thought your Jackson Hole paper, which you've drawn some of this material from, was absolutely brilliant at optimizing the Taylor rule, essentially. And I'd recommend it to anyone interested. But you're wondering where the recent cuts have come from. Isn't it clear that the Fed is following the market. The market's taken rates down. I think from an academic perspective, people think the market is just following Fed expectations. But in analyzing the market, it certainly seems as if there are fundamentals that affect interest rates. And beyond the first year or so, looking out at the yield curve, the first year reflects Fed policy, but beyond that, they're independent drivers of interest rates beyond the Fed's influence. Certainly, I think one of them is the huge balance sheet overhang. Historically, that's been a very serious, very significant factor in depressing the real level of interest rates. Whatever you think the driver is, do you think you can just follow a Taylor type of rule and be oblivious to what the market is indicating?
Yeah, so let me very briefly say that that's exactly the point of specifying a benchmark rule, that you can point to the rule and say, look, our projection of real GDP hasn't changed. Our projection of inflation hasn't changed. The 1.6 core PCE was temporary. Like, just look at our projections. As a result, there is no need to change policy on the basis of the macroeconomic outlook. Now, well, if the Fed follows the market or not, that's a discretionary decision. So whether discretion can be explained as being politically motivated or following the market is really very similar to me. It's a discretionary decision that I cannot understand. What I would have preferred for the Federal Reserve to do is tell me clearly, we have a benchmark rule, and we're following it, unless there is some reason not to. If the Fed right now believes that there is some important reason not to follow a benchmark rule, then they should explain how. But that should be a rare event. This should not be happening on a day-to-day basis. Let me stop here because we have no time to.
Yeah, great question. I do see some other hands, but let's hear from Andy, and then we'll continue to take questions, and there'll be more time for questions at the end, too.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here and to be now a member of this very distinguished group. A lot of the thinking that I've been doing over the last 10 years is on governance. How do you design an institution that works well? The paper that I've written with David Archer at the BIS, we identified two key risks to central banks, to monetary policy. One is political interference, and I think the previous panel talked a lot about this, and I think Charlie Plosser is going to talk more in a few minutes. The other risk is the risk of groupthink, of insularity, of not thinking outside the box, of going over a cliff. Part of the reason I started thinking about that so much is because I was at the Fed in 2005 and 6 and 7 and 8 in the Monetary Affairs Division, where looking back, it was clear that we were way too complacent and that we weren't thinking outside the box hard enough. So I'm trying as hard as I can to avoid making that mistake again. It's hard to avoid it. But so what I want to do with my 12 or 13 minutes is to kind of identify some issues here, both about the Fed Listens initiative that's currently underway, and then talk more specifically about the Fed's toolbox, because I'm worried that we as a profession and the Federal Reserve in particular is too complacent about its toolbox. So just starting with this initiative, I think it's a great initiative. We're now 10 years after the start of the recovery in 2009, the NBR's dated recovery. It's a good time to look back, lessons learned. That's a good thing for an organization to do, lessons learned. What have we learned from that? And then, planning going forward. One of the key lessons from what happened in the past was stress tests. We talked about this quite a bit at dinner last night, right? Stress tests have been very helpful discipline. There's always room for improvement in them, of course, but a helpful discipline to basically ask private institutions, think about the following material risks and think about how those would affect your organization and formulate contingency plans how you would respond. That seems sensible for any organization to do. What's disappointing to me is the Federal Reserve has not imposed that same discipline on itself. So look at the stress test that the Federal Reserve asked the private institutions to do earlier this year, okay? It's a severe adverse scenario where unemployment goes up to 10%, house prices drop a lot. It's a very bleak scenario, but not totally implausible. That's why they asked the private institutions to think hard about it. And my question is, if that scenario is a material risk sometime in the next few years, not a benchmark outlook, but a material risk, what's the Fed's plan? And we cannot be blindsided. The Fed cannot be blindsided. If that happens and the Fed is not prepared, there could be very severe consequences, economic consequences, families suffering, losing their homes, losing their jobs, losing their savings. And there could be very severe political consequences too. So we as a profession and the Federal Reserve really needs to think carefully about this. The Federal Reserve should start imposing the same, I call it stress test for monetary policy, impose that discipline on itself. Start formulating contingency plans, discuss those plans with Congress, discuss them with financial markets, discuss them with academic experts and scholars and other central banks so that everyone kind of knows, like a physician does. We hope everything's going to keep getting better. The brakes should come off next week. Then we'll do physical therapy. Okay. But, if things don't go according to plan, don't worry. We have a backup plan. That's really critical. Okay. So let's talk for a second about the Fed Listens initiative. One thing that bothers me about the title of it, it sounds great at first, but then you kind of wonder, like, okay, but so weren't they listening before? Seriously, weren't they listening before? My experience at the Federal Reserve was it's like a fortress with 10-foot thick walls where it's absolutely silent inside. The fortress might be in the middle of a big city, but you cannot hear anything outside. It's like a palace in Seoul, Korea. I think there's one or more of them in Tokyo too, where it just, you hear nothing from outside. Likewise, after I left the Federal Reserve, I kind of feel like I'm now outside the fortress. I can throw little rocks at the walls, but just, okay. And so that's not a good organization, by the way. That's a recipe for groupthink. Okay, so the Fed should be listening all the time. And I think one conclusion they could reach, as soon as the end of this year, is that they're going to start to listen all the time, every year. They're going to hold outside events like they've been doing, meeting with scholars, inviting even wider range of papers and input to really try on an ongoing basis to keep questioning their own assumptions and doing lessons learned and developing better contingency planning. Another problem with listening is who are you listening to? Bloomberg wrote a great editorial, the editorial board of Bloomberg recently. They said, it seems like the Fed's only listening to the penumbra. And I had to look in, because I'm not an astronomer, what's the penumbra? Well, penumbra is when there's an eclipse. You can see the very edges of the sun. That's the penumbra. Like, it's not the sun, but it's like the very edge of the disk. Okay, and this is the problem, right? When you have too much insularity, is you talk to people that are literally outside the fortress, but they just barely, or they just left the fortress last week, and okay. So really trying to think outside the box, not just the penumbra. Okay. The third question here is, what is besides just listening, what's the actual consequence of this going to be? And when you look at the minutes of the July meeting, which is when the Fed had an extensive discussion of this, it seemed like many people on the committee may be comfortable with saying, oh, we're pretty happy with how everything's going. We've done a great job over the last 10 years. We feel like all our tools are working well. We're fine. We're not going to actually make any significant changes. Okay, I personally think that would be a big mistake. And I think that saying, oh, we're listening, but then doing nothing suggests, in some cases, I have this experience with my son. My son Henry he's brilliant, he's wonderful, he's creative, really wonderful person. But he and I talked about this the other day. He's like, yeah, I understand, Papa. Because I say, Henry, are you listening? And of course he says, yes, I'm listening. Okay, So the point is, if the Fed says they're listening, let's see them prove it by actually taking some things seriously and making some significant adjustments. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about the Fed's toolbox. Should the Fed be satisfied with the toolbox? If you ask ordinary Americans about the last 10 years, they think it's been pretty lousy. It took a long time for the employment and the job market to get back to some semblance of normality. And you see it not just in the unemployment rate, you see it in prime age labor force participation, which is still recovering. So for some American families, at least, it doesn't look like we're even done yet in terms of recovering from the last financial crisis. That's too long, too painful. And I think the Fed has to ask the question, are there better tools that would be more effective than last time to do a better job that really benefits average American families? Second thing, the Fed seems, based on the minutes, to be very complacent about QE. And I just don't understand it. I really don't understand it. And we talk about this in this paper. Michael Bordo and I have a Hoover paper we gave at Cato earlier this year. It's published in the Cato Journal, where we show evidence about QE3. And if you just turn for a second here, just look, it's on page 6 of my paper. I just want to show you this for 1 second. Table 1. Was QE helpful or counterproductive? The theory that Fed economists have been using, and I was one of them, okay, back when I was inside the fortress, I was one of them, is that quantitative easing reduces the term premium, and that improves credit conditions, promotes stronger growth, and promotes a stronger recovery. That was the theory, and believe it or not, that's still the mechanism that's been used in papers Federal Reserve staff have issued this year. Okay, but you look at table 1, the first column says, okay, if that theory was right, at each of these FOMC announcements, what would we predict would have happened to the term premium? It's green, minus 17, minus 11, minus 3, minus 2. And then you look at the actual changes in the term premium. In every single one of those cases, it went the wrong way. We're all familiar with the taper tantrum. We think, oh, well, that just happened in spring of the following year. The truth is this was a whole sequence of taper tantrums. And now we look at the last couple of weeks, and the European Central Bank, they're facing tough challenges, for sure. Inflation's way below their goal. The economy is weakening. They're trying to figure out what to do about it. They introduced some new policy measures. What's happened to the term premium, the bond yields in the last few days? Gone up. And why is that? Well, part of it, why this could be counterproductive, is because it's opaque and it's confusing, and it's not clear what the longer run strategy and plan is, and actually might actually be, it's like a chemotherapy where the side effects swamp everything, and the physicians say, look, we got to stop that and find something else to do. Okay, so that's QE. What about forward guidance? The Fed, in its minutes and in the recent speeches of officials, they're talking about makeup strategies. Sounds good. Oh, makeup strategy. Well, we can't do something. Things don't go as well as we want to. We'll make up for it later. The problem with a makeup strategy is it depends on a very long forecast horizon. 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years. Do we really think that that's going to work according to plan? One reason it works is because it may not work is because the Fed officials themselves can't even figure things out at that horizon. Another reason it may not work is because the Fed committee rotates over time, and the new people who come in 3, 5 years later may not see things the same way. Another reason it may not work is because we just don't understand the economy well enough, which I think is why Athanasius and others have been trying to look for simple benchmarks that may respond to near-term forecasts, but really are basically responding to what's happening in the economy today. Now, I'm just going to conclude here by saying Michael Bordo and I have been advocating for the last several years that the right way forward is to move toward digital cash, mitigate the effect of lower bound. We can't talk about it in detail right now, but I just want to say that this is another case of insularity and groupthink. Because as of 6 months or a year ago, most central banks around the world were in the mode of, digital cash, maybe that's something over the next 5, 10, 20 years we'll definitely be thinking about. Well, Libra was announced in June, and the head of the BIS, the manager of the BIS says this is a wake-up call. we gotta be thinking hard now about what central banks are gonna do in the realm of digital cash. Otherwise, it could all become private, and we really need to be concerned about that possibility. It's a wake-up call. Is the Federal Reserve listening to the wake-up call? I mean, it would be great to have a congressional hearing about it where Federal Reserve officials talk about their plans. It'd be great to have a Fed Listens initiative. It would be great for the shadow to have a whole, discussion about digital cash. This is not just a hypothetical anymore. This is reality coming. Libra indicates they're going to launch middle of next year. By the second shadow meeting from now, Libra will be live. And we'll be starting to see, well, how's that affecting the global financial system, the global economy? How is it affecting monetary market? All these things are urgent problems. Wake-up call. So again, thank you very much for this chance to share with you, and I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. That was great. Mike Dotsey from the Philly Fed is here, and I see him jumping out of his seat, so let's give him a chance.
Yeah, so I'm the research director at the Philly Fed, and I think this Fed Listens should really have been labeled Board of Governors Listens, because I can tell you that the reserve banks have been out in the community. When we heard this initiative, we said, what do you mean? We are out there all the time. We have diverse groups. We're meeting with community activists. We're meeting with bankers. We're meeting with businessmen. We're talking to them all the time. The reserve banks are out there, and we've always been out there. Regarding the digital currency, we are thinking about it. And just to announce that in the spring, the Philly Fed will be having a special conference dealing with digital currency.
Yeah, I guess this is the first announcement of that. Is it public information?
No, we haven't, got the whole thing.
Okay, but we shouldn't say anything about it until,
It'll be by invitation.
Yeah, okay.
If you want to be invited, I'll invite.
Well, forget about me. Invite Michael Bordo. Okay, look. So for the first thing that Michael Dotsey said, I totally agree with. I believe strongly in the regional Federal Reserve System. I think that's a tremendous strength of the Fed, having diverse people from around the country, that are engaged on an ongoing basis with people in their communities, with their community bankers, with manufacturers in their district, with labor unions and ordinary working people and retired people in their district. I totally agree with that. And so maybe because remember, I spent my 20 years in the Board of Governors, so maybe my experience of these thick walls was maybe Michael Dotsey's right, that was because I was in the wrong place. But that said, I think trying to think about how to strengthen the Federal Reserve as an institution is an important priority, and we need to grapple with it. I would like to see a world in which the regional Federal Reserve Bank presidents vote at every FOMC meeting. That would be my ideal. Forget about the rotation system. All 12 of them vote at every meeting. Can we make changes in the Federal Reserve Act? Might go along with some other changes we could talk about some other time. But could we make the Federal Reserve Act so that it increased the extent to which the regional Federal Reserve banks and the presidents of the regional Fed banks have an even stronger voice, as opposed to just being, incremental kind of kibitzers on the sidelines, which I think is, at least in my experience, was true a lot of the time. So anyway, so great question. Thank you, Mike.
Athanasios.
Thanks. So it's Andy, because both of us were inside the. How did you describe that building again? Fortress. Nobody can listen to us. Both of us were there in the early 2000s. I think I just want to say that I agree with you, and I think the Fed should be applauded for the Fed Listens, which is what you said as well. I think the Fed was listening, and it's a matter of to what extent, not enough, and I think the effort to listen to broader groups than they were listening in the past when we were on the inside is to be applauded. And I also agree that the reserve banks were actually doing a much, much better job with outreach all along. So the reason I asked our chairman to intervene is because I think the message that I heard coming out of your paper is a positive one. The Fed actually is progressing by recognizing the need to listen, and the question is to help the institution improve by listening, and by listening correctly with the examples that you've given. But we shouldn't miss the fact that this is progress to some extent.
Again, I would only say that if something substantial comes out of the end, and part of which would be a commitment to continuing to listen on an ongoing basis from the Board of Governors, maybe that is the right way to think about this. But if at the end of all this, they just say, oh, we're going to pat ourselves in the back. We're doing a great job. Now we know everyone loves us, and we're just going to stick with what we're doing. I think that would be unfortunate. A good organization brings in a management consultant every year, and a really good CEO says, tell us what we're missing. Tell us how can we improve, and we're going to take it really seriously. I'll say one more thing, put it on the table. The Federal Reserve should start having regular reviews by the GAO. The GAO is another independent agency. It reviews almost every other federal agency. The Federal Reserve should be viewing the GAO as an ally. If the GAO says, hey, these policies are actually pretty good and reasonable, that could provide some protection, against political interference. Why has the Federal Reserve historically been so resistant to having the GAO come in and just do reviews? I just have never understood it. Even when I was inside the fortress, I didn't understand it. Again, there's ways forward here. There's ways for the Federal Reserve to improve. I hope this Fed Listens thing creates the opportunity to do some of that.
Excellent. Thanks, Andy. Let's move on to the next paper, and again, at the end, we can take more questions.
Before I begin, I was invited inside the fortress to that Chicago Fed Listens, and I agree it was a step forward, but all of the academic papers that assess the efficacy of monetary policy that were given by outsiders were based on the Fed's Furbus model and DSGE model, which everybody knows hasn't been working, but everybody presumed it was working. And in the 2-day meeting, I was the only person in the whole place that mentioned money and mentioned IOER, and both of them fell on deaf ears. Okay, so tariffs and the Fed's monetary policy have been the two key factors driving the economy and financial markets, really since spring of 2018. And as Mike Bordeaux and I analyze in our paper, tariffs and monetary policy are a toxic mix. President Trump's objectives with China, opening up China's markets, addressing its treatment of intellectual property, cybersecurity, international security issues. These are very important goals with potentially large benefits, yet relying exclusively on tariffs as a lever are misplaced, and the economic costs are mounting. So I will discuss the costs of the escalating tariffs and how they are affecting monetary policy and the Fed. And Mike will discuss the history of the ebbs and flows of tariffs, protectionism, and immigration policies, and the important lessons they provide for today. So just quickly, the recent research on the economic effects of tariffs, including some very interesting research by the Federal Reserve Board staff, suggests strongly that the negative
economic effects of the uncertainty, the policy-related uncertainties, President Trump's erratic and unpredictable threats and tactics, China's retaliations, all the back and forth, and not just with China, but I don't need to go into detail. These, the economic effects of these uncertainties are larger than the economic effects of the tariffs per se. And that's what the literature is focusing on. It's very interesting. The biggest impacts on the U.S. and globally are the negative impact on business fixed investment and the distortions and disruptions to global supply chains. And here, a very important point needs to be made. There's no question but that the tariffs and uncertainties are reducing what economists call aggregate demand. But through the distortions and the cumulative negative effect on capital spending, which affects capital inputs to production processes, over time, and they are affecting productive capacity. So what's happening now is constraints on productive capacity and supply. And that's a critically important point. So uncertainty measures are at an all-time high, and we just took like the Baker-Bloom-Davis uncertainty and just a simple correlation with U.S. capital spending is 0.49, and then there's much more rigorous analysis in the research that shows it's clearly having an impact. So far, the economic impact on the U.S. Is fairly modest, but it's a much larger impact on China and some of its largest trading partners like Japan, South Korea, other Asian nations, Brazil, and standing out like a sore thumb, Germany. And a very nice composite statistic of global trade volumes put out by the Finance Ministry of the Netherlands shows that global trade volumes are declining, okay, and they don't show any sign of turning around. And global industrial production is declining, and business fixed investment is weak. So the way I think about the U.S., and I think, Athanasios, the chart in your piece that shows nominal GDP and real accelerate in 2017, 18, and now come back down. My read of it is the positive impulses from the deregulatory environment and the tax reforms that boosted real activity and boosted capital spending are now being fully offset by the tariffs and the tariff-related uncertainties. Now, how does this affect the Fed? And this takes off from Athanasios' paper. So the Fed eased in July and September, even though all of the economic data suggested strongly the economy was growing along the path that the Fed had predicted, and in fact, along the path the Fed estimates to be potential growth. So basically, the Fed abandoned its data dependence after several years, and Charlie told us how the Fed sets a goalpost and then changes it. It clearly changed it, and in their July statement, their policy statement, they included one sentence that used the word uncertainty, and this left people scratching their heads. And are they responding to financial markets? Absolutely. Are they fearful of a big stock market correction? Absolutely. But then Chairman Powell embellished on this at the Jackson Hole meeting, where he talked extensively about uncertainty. And so this brings out the point that the Fed's abandoned its data dependence approach and is relying on its hunches about risks, but also uncertainties, and we know the difference between the two. And this, will the Fed's hunches about risk and uncertainty be right? They may be or they may not be, but deviating from any kind of systematic approach really exposes the Fed in a lot of ways. And then this brings up this other critical issue. Monetary policy is capable of addressing and offsetting a slump in aggregate demand, but it is incapable of addressing and offsetting a constraint on potential growth, a shift in an aggregate supply. And the Fed needs to abide by the literature and what some of its researchers are showing. And even if the Fed eases and it doesn't work, you're left with lower interest rates, which have come with distortions. And then Mike and I agree with this whole notion of an insurance policy when the Fed is very concerned about the zero lower bound. And then adding to all of this is all the very inappropriate barbs that the president is throwing at the Fed. So the suggestions we have for the Fed in the current very difficult situation is, be systematic, be rules-based. It's far better than basing your policies on hunches about uncertainties and risks. Be much more cognizant about the proper scope and limitations of monetary policy, what it's able to accomplish. And then thirdly, emphasize the importance of remaining absolutely independent and at the same time maintaining your political neutrality. So I'll stop there. Michael?
Okay, I'll follow the tradition of every time I'm here I talk about history. And what I want to talk about is the really big risk of what's going on today with these tariffs, and the risk is ending what is called the second year of globalization. So the Trump tariffs on China and other countries, retaliation against the U.S., and the increase in trade policy uncertainty has resonance for what happened to the global economy during the interwar period, when the first great era of globalization collapsed and contributed to a plunge into autarky and depression. Although history never repeats, it rhymes. So understanding the lessons from the past can aid us in avoiding a recurrence of its serious policy errors. So the world has experienced two eras of globalization in the past 2 centuries. So in the handout, if you look at, there's a figure 3 that basically shows you this pattern. Okay, and an understanding of what happened to end the first year of globalization is a very important cautionary tale for the considerable risks that the global economy faces from the current trade policies followed by the Trump administration. So the first era of globalization, from the middle of the 19th century to August 1914, there was a massive transformation in international trade, financial globalization, and mass migration. And the growth of trade relative to income began in the early 19th century. It was driven by technological change, which vastly reduced the cost of shipping goods across the world. And there's a lot of evidence on this, and I won't go into that. I mentioned it in the paper. Just to give you some numbers, that between 1815 and 1914, trade measured by exports grew by 3.5% versus income growth of 2.7%. And in addition to the falling transport costs, another big fill-up for the growth of trade was big reductions in tariff protection. That began with Great Britain's reduction of the Corn Laws, tariffs after the Napoleonic Wars, which led to the repeal in 1846. And that movement of free trade spread across Europe. There was a treaty between France and Britain called the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, which set up reciprocal trade and the most favored nation clauses, and this spread from Britain and France to the rest of Europe, and tariffs fell from on average 35% to about 10%. Okay, at the same time, financial markets, financial integration really took off between 1870 and 1914. And again, part of that's driven by technology, by the telegraph, by the cable, and lots of financial innovation that occurred. And in this period, just to give you an example of how important it was, the stock of global foreign assets relative to world GDP reached a peak of 20% in 1930, and it was not surpassed again until the very end of the 20th century. And the British held the lion's share of this overseas investment, followed by close to 50%, followed by France and by Germany. And this was really important for the countries of new settlement like us, Canada, et cetera, which received this capital. Okay, and so this, and another factor, okay, so I mentioned technology, communication. Another key factor was the gold standard, and adherence to the gold convertibility by the major nations of the world ensured stable exchange rates and acted as a commitment mechanism, what I called in a paper with my colleague Hugh Rockoff as a good housekeeping seal of approval, which in a sense was required for these emerging countries to get access to the capital. Well, all that ended with World War I and subsequently the Great Depression. But it's interesting that many of the seeds of its destruction really started in that period, before World War I, and that the backlash, which we're experiencing today, had a lot of parallels way back then. So one thing that happened was you had massive migration in this period as well. Okay, and what that did, so there were three things. There was the growth of trade, capital, and migration. So what that did was, in a sense, there was what's called factor price equalization, an equalization of real wages across the world, especially across the Atlantic. So what that did was it reduced the rents to land in Europe, which was labor abundant and capital scarce, and it had an effect in North America and the other new countries of in a sense of reducing the real wages of labor, especially at the bottom end. And so this led to a political backlash. It led to tariffs being raised in Europe and restrictions put on migration in North America, Argentina, Australia, etc. And so you already started to see this pushback occurring before World War I. Okay, with respect to capital flows, capital flows in this period also was associated with financial crises and asset price booms. Okay, we didn't get a backlash until the interwar period, but that also collapsed. And the gold standard had its issues. Okay, and one was these waves of inflation and deflation. So the deflation that we had in the late 19th century, led to a backlash with the movement for free silver in the United States. Okay, and in other countries also there's a backlash against the gold standard. So World War I, in a sense, really marked the end of it, and all countries left the gold standard. Okay, and there was an increase in tariffs across the world. Immigration stopped. Okay, and then capital controls were imposed later in the 1930s. And the Great Depression, in a sense, finished it off. And during the Great Depression, we had a massive increase in tariffs, and this country was really at the vanguard of that. It started with the Fordney-McCumber Act in 1922, followed by the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. Other countries retaliated, okay, and we had this, in a sense, almost a complete stopping of trade by the end of the 1930s. So that's the lesson. So that's the story. What's the lesson? Well, there's some similarities to the interwar period, okay, and but I'm going to say there are also some big differences, okay. Tariffs went up in both periods, but the orders of magnitude were much greater. Okay, tariffs went up 5 times as much. Okay, so I just read recently that our tariffs have gone up to 10%, which is a big number. Okay, but back then, the Smoot-Hawley tariff went up to 80%, 80 to 90%. So it's not as much. Migration's being restricted, but again, it's nothing like what happened in the 1920s. Okay, so there was, these things are happening today. They happened back then. It's not to say it's as bad, but also there's some other things you want to take into account, other differences. We haven't imposed capital controls yet, although I think there's a congressional bill out there that's talking about it. And the structure of the world economy's changed. So the advanced countries in the interwar had shifted from agriculture to manufacturing. And the tariffs that happened were largely on manufacturing, so they were hard hit. So what's happened today is the advanced countries have moved to services, the emerging countries have moved to manufacturing, and the tariffs, in a sense, are going to have much bigger effects on them. And then the point that Mickey mentioned was that there's been a greater integration in the production process across the world. The most important development was the growth of the global supply chains, which started in the 1980s. And what's been happening is that the supply chains are being cut back by the tariffs, because the tariffs really do affect intermediate goods. They also did in the interwar. So to the extent that the Smoot-Hawley tariff was a big problem, was because it was affecting the supply chain. So it could be that these effects are definitely a resonance to what happened. So even though there's differences, there's some things to think about. And there's still a good chance that this is going to lead, or is leading to global recession. It's going to affect us. Okay, now, one of the things I wanted to say towards the end is that, the things that, in a sense, I'm saying it's pretty bad, but there are also things that are pretty good. So one of the things that's different from back then is that policymakers today have a far deeper understanding of how to stabilize the economy. Okay, they really didn't back then. So the presence of monetary fiscal policy tools, automatic stabilizers, international monetary and fiscal policy coordination, as well as the heightened sophistication of financial markets and capital flows, greatly reduces the likelihoods we're going to have a 1930s disaster. But there's still a big risk, and so I want to close with this point, that further increases in trade protection and barriers that slow the flows of migration will reverse the economic advances of the second era of globalization that began after the collapse of Bretton Woods. That would greatly harm U.S. economic performance, with lower long-run growth prospects. In present value terms, that would translate into significant losses in the standard of living and well-being. This, I think, would be a tragedy because it would have been caused by preventable policy errors. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions and comments. I overlooked you at the beginning. Actually, she's coming with the microphone.
Yeah, I had a question, I guess, for Athanasius, and maybe a comment and an implicit question, and for Mickey as well. When we look at your charts, you make the good point that based on all those policy roles, you can't see why the Fed, cut 50 basis points. And this may be a classic example of the Fed changing the rules in the middle. They haven't changed their forecast, as you point out, but they definitely have changed the distribution around that forecast. And by saying uncertainty and downside risk, they're saying it's become skewed to the left side. In maybe Mickey's term, that's their hunch, that it's become skewed. So they've made a policy change, call it an insurance policy change, because the probability of the outcome being below that forecast is increased in their mind and their hunch. Now, they don't show you that probability distribution, so it is kind of a change in the rules of the road, But I think that explains it. Also, I think the probabilities about them hitting their inflation target. They show it going up towards the 2%, but I think they also feel that the risks are that they'll fall short of that. And sort of ironically, 3 months ago, the chairman said this is a temporary slowdown in inflation, and he's proving to be correct. Just this morning, the PCE number came out and now shows September or August to August is up to 1.8%. It has been stepping up from the slowdown, but I think that's the comment that they don't show you the distribution and what they're saying, and the reason it's never going to be picked up in the rolls, because it is based on a hunch, is that they're worried about not reaching that. I think that explains it, but it's why it doesn't show up in the roll, because it's kind of a change in the rules of the road to add probability distributions to their mean forecast.
So let me address this issue, and I will actually refer to something Mickey mentioned as well that is pertinent to this. As I mentioned in my presentation, if you do not follow a systematic policy and you rely on discretionary action, you can always find some reason to explain what you do. But I don't think this is good in the current juncture or in general. So another simpler explanation for the phenomenon you have is, the Fed got politically pressured and responded with a 50 basis points cut. And I hope that's not right. But if I don't have a clear explanation as to why the easing came, then I worry about it. And as the four chairmen told us, perceptions, just perceptions, are very harmful. Now, as to the point of should we care about risk scenario and should we incorporate that in the analysis? Absolutely, and occasionally that could lead us to deviate from a benchmark rule. But it cannot be the rule that you always deviate from the rule you never specified. That's not really helpful. And when it comes to the current situation, I can understand that there are downside scenarios on aggregate demand, as Mickey pointed out, and in the paper with Mike, we do see the concerns on global trade. But at the same time, again, as Mickey pointed out, it's not clear to me that the shortfall in aggregate supply is not at least as big as the shortfall in aggregate demand. So on net, I don't think that's an argument for easing policy if you're taking that risk into account. And I would like to see more analysis along these lines. So the analysis could be, and this is one thing that have been suggested, I suggested it and others have suggested as well, perhaps the SEP could be modified. One of the things that could be done is the addition of risk scenarios. If trade is a risk scenario that is driving policy, perhaps we could see that being clearly communicated by committee participants in the deliberation, rather than just being a hunch. Hunches are not really a very scientific way of formulating policy.
Don't misunderstand me. I'm agreeing with you. I guess I'm saying the Fed called it audible, and you're right. They call audibles all the time to deviate from the rules, but I think I was just saying that's why it's not picked up in your formulations, because you're right. They don't stick to those. In this case, that was the nature of the audible that they called, without a lot of explanation, leaving the impression it was really politically motivated.
Stuart, let me make two quick comments. The Fed, now Powell at Jackson Hole emphasized in his speech the uncertainties about future trade policy and its effects. Now, the fact that they eased based on that is is a departure from their historic behavior regarding other policies. The Fed has always made it a practice, as they did in 2017. We do not respond to anticipated changes in fiscal policy, tax policy. We will change if the actual data changes as a consequence of the change in fiscal policy. So this is a departure. The other just simple point I might want to make is to the extent that the tariffs, ratcheting up of tariffs, and the uncertainties are the key factors constraining business investment. With bond yields already ridiculously low and the cost of capital low, do you think easing 25 basis points is going to offset that supply constraint, and all of a sudden businesses are going to say, whippy, let's go out and expand?
I'm going to interrupt, and the woman there has been waiting patiently.
Sinam Sanmaz, Baruch College. This question is for Antonios. To what extent does the performance of the stock market force the Fed's hand as it does for the ECB? And what effect does the inverting yield curve has had on the recent Fed decision? Some Fed governors have also mentioned that the inverting yield curve is a major concern.
Briefly, for the stock market and any other financial variable, I mean, we can integrate this into standard systematic policy if we link them to a change in the outlook for the economy. So if financial variables influence GDP downward, then the Fed could respond to the revision in the outlook. And this is a way to make systematic the policy response to the effects of the financial sector. So that will be for the stock market and related variables. With respect to inversion of the term structure, well, that's a forecasting device. So in principle, any factor that can influence the probabilities of GDP declining in the future will be incorporated. To some extent, that factor will be incorporated as well, unless the forecasters explain this in other reasons. And the committee's projections, I think, and the professional forecasters that the Philly Fed is providing, I think they're very useful summaries for giving us this snapshot of where do you think the economy is going. That's why I look at them as a very useful input for understanding policy. I wouldn't want to use any specific indicator in isolation from the rest.
Anne-Marie, do you have?
Yes. A specific question, excuse me, for Andrew Levin about stress tests. And my impression is that the stress tests for the banks are predominantly one-sided. How would the banks respond in the event that there is a recession, that there is deflation, and so forth? That has disturbed me somewhat right along with regard to the banks. I'd like them also to report how they would respond and act in the event of a pickup in inflation, in the event of unsustainable boom and an unsustainable inflation. But when we come to suggesting stress tests for the Fed, should they be two-sided? And don't they already have them? Don't they explore alternative scenarios in both directions? They used to back in the day when I was around.
They're great questions. One thing I love about the Fed, and it's the only central bank in the world that does this, is after a 5-year lag, pretty much everything gets published. The transcript of the meeting discussion gets published. All the staff documents that went to the committee get published. Okay, so you're right. Now this is the fortress again. I was there, right? We called it the Blue Book in those days. Altonis remembers this, right? And every Blue Book had alternative scenarios generated from FRBUS with all the limitations that Mickey mentioned. Okay, and go back and look. September 2008, 2 days after Lehman failed, okay, look at the Blue Book and the alternative scenarios, okay? All those scenarios they chose, and I can say we chose, I was kind of there, all the scenarios fit into the confidence bands of the FRBUS model, which were clearly way too small. The most severe scenario was one where unemployment went up by 0.5 point. There was nothing like a 10% unemployment, sort of scenario. Okay, now, Yes, they do those alternative scenarios in the background. They should be doing them with multiple models. They should be publishing them in not in 5 years, but say fairly soon after, maybe with the minutes to say, hey, these are the things we're looking at. Here's the models we're using. I forget who said it earlier this morning. Maybe it was you, Charlie. Someone said, put things out there so the public can respond. Okay, well, that's the point, right? So, yes, it should be two-sided. And the fiscal thing is a good example of this. I think Mickey was mentioning a minute ago. In 2017, the Federal Reserve could have said, look, there is a scenario where the fiscal stimulus drives a very strong movement upward in aggregate demand that starts pushing inflation significantly above our target. And here's a scenario that we think would represent that risk, and here's how we think we might need to respond in that circumstance. It doesn't tie you down, but it gives you an idea. So this should become a standard part of the Fed's communications.
Thanks. I think we have to cut it off here. I'm sorry to people who are patiently waiting. What I'd like to do now, I think, rather than disrupt things just a little bit before lunch, is to invite Charlie right up right away. And he's going to synthesize, bring things together, and as I said, offer some thoughts of his own. Yes, he will solve all our problems.